Welcome to our second parent session of a Learner's Toolkit. My name is Dr. Terry Byers and we're going to focus on habit formation today. What we're going to look at is today the creation of habit formation and how it can actually help our students when it comes to looking at their study and homework routines at home. Today we're trialing a live version of today's session. What this is going to do is to look at how you can engage with us in the chat. Also, what it will do is it will allow us for you to engage and ask questions. So you can ask and type any questions into the chat that you would like to talk about at any stage today. And we are looking at hoping that this more engaging and interactive format can actually provide you some value. So we're going to get started by going and looking at some of the research around habit formation. And from this, what it will allow us to do is to give you some tips and tricks and tools that you can use with your son at home. So if we look at the idea of habit formation, what we need to understand is that there are what they call the 3 R's of habit formation. What we see here is the idea that when a student is, or anyone is actually building a habit at home, there are the 3 R's of habit formation. And this is a fairly well-established theory when we look at habit formation, whether it be at any stage of our life. So what we need to understand here is that habit formation is based on the 3 R's, and they are a reminder, routine, and reward. What's really interesting here is that when we look at the 3 R's, is that the 3 R's work often hidden from each other and often hidden from us when we're actually building a habit from scratch. So let's look at the first one, reminder. So reminder is where we're basically creating a cue, and that cue is the mechanism that tells us that we need to engage in that particular habit. So for example, let's say I have a habit of a morning coffee. So every day I come down and the first thing I see when I wake up in the morning is I walk into the kitchen and I see my coffee machine. Basically, what that's telling me is that the cue based on my environment, number 1, it's the morning. Number 2, I'm in the kitchen. And number 3, I can see my coffee machine. What this is telling me is at this point in time, I start my day off with a coffee. What this is telling us is that our environment and also the context that we're in and the objects within that context actually create a series of cues that trigger our behavior. That alone doesn't actually establish a habit. What establishes a habit is the routine, or the second R, or repetition. What this is a daily routine where every morning I wake up and I have a coffee. What we're seeing here is that over time, I'm conditioning myself that when I see that coffee machine in the morning, that I'm actually going to have the coffee. The coffee machine itself is there and it's acting as a cue that triggers my behavior. But over time, that routine is actually supporting me to establish that habitual behavior of having a coffee in the morning. And the last R, is reward. What we see here with the reward this time is the idea that there's some sort of benefit for engaging in the behavior. So for me, the reward is having a cup of coffee, and obviously the secondary benefit of getting that caffeine kick in the morning. What we need to understand is that these elements work together and over a period of time create a habit. Importantly, that these little triggers over a period of time also make it very hard for me to break that habit. And what we need to understand is that the habit comes through this cycle. And what we need to understand is that when we are creating a habit, or when we're trying to break a habit, or when we're trying to build a much more improved habit, these three elements need to actually take place. So what we see here is the habit loop, and the habit loop builds in another important element, and that is the craving part. The craving, or I like it. What we need to understand is most of us engage in a habit because it is deriving some benefit for us, in many cases meeting a need. So again, when we look at this habit loop, the craving actually helps us. So for example, when we open up the fridge, okay, I see the fridge, I open up the fridge, I have a craving, I might be drinking, have chocolate, or I might drink a soft drink or anything like that, and the response. So I'm not going to go out and just go and take a drink of soft drink because there's the response there. There would be some form of craving that is actually there. And obviously, over time, the reward is getting the sugary drink. And what we need to understand here is that habits are greater than the intent. And what we need to understand is this is why some habits are much easier for us to overcome, and sometimes the stronger habits, and in the work of Neil, Quinn, and Wood, is what's really interesting. The strong habits require very little intent, and as a result, there's little will in actually establishing it and getting it going. Basically, what this is that when we are developing a habit for the first time, aka a weak habit, because the intention is there, if I actually want to keep going with that habit over a period of time, I'm actually going to need more frequent, and there needs to be greater intent. But the stronger the habit, though, I might not engage with it daily, but it is always sitting there, and it is easy for us to actually retain that over a period of time, which is why some bad habits are very hard to kick. And the literature is interesting that for some of us, there's a habit that's always there. When we look at things like alcoholism, gambling, and drug addiction, they are all a version of habit. What's interesting here is that when the habit becomes very strong, even though I might not engage with that habit for a prolonged period of time, what happens is, because it's such a strong habit, I don't need to engage with it. And the intent that I actually need to carry that habit through is very, very minor. But I hit that habit, I hit that behavior, I am cued, and as a result, I engage with that habit, even though I know that it can be quite destructive. So what we need to understand is that when we're at home, or when our boys are at home, and the same for you, and they're doing work, what's really interesting is that we need to see the habit of doing study and homework as the 3 R's, the cue, the environment. What that means is that they need a common place to actually do their study and homework on a regular basis, because the environment is going to cue their behavior. Repetition, whether I do my homework at the kitchen table, or the study at the kitchen table, or in my room, the key thing there is I need to repeatedly go back to that same location so that I engage with that behavior. And then the reward is obviously getting the job done as quickly as possible. The issue is, though, sometimes our environment works against us. And if we think about it, if in my room I have a gaming machine, or a TV, or music, or etc., my environment is telling me that situation isn't really set up to do work. So if there's all that distraction there, it's going to be very hard for me to change my behavior, because my cue, based on my environment, is telling me that I actually not actually doing homework or study. My environment isn't built for homework or study. Therefore, I'm continually fighting the cue telling me that my behavior should be something different than it currently is. Also, what we need to understand as well is that if we do want to break a habit, there are ways in which we can actually break down those 3 R's. And if we think about it, when we want to break habits, there are 2 main ways. The first one is known as going upstream. And this is something that James Clear, who wrote the book Atomic Habits, often talks about. What he talks about is that we know that these habits are always going to be there. And one of the things is that when we go upstream, what we're doing is we're putting things in place that are making it harder and harder and harder for me to engage with that particular habit. And what we need to understand is much about this around habits is actually can be applied beyond just study and homework in our everyday lives. And you as parents and people in the workplace, you would also be under the effect of habits at their various stages. So how do we want to break a habit? Firstly, let's look at going upstream. So the first one is the trigger. The trigger is the easiest way to break the routine. So for example, if I wanted to kick my coffee habit, my one-a-day coffee habit in the morning, the first thing I need to do is I need to remove the trigger. And the trigger isn't the coffee machine in the kitchen. So if I wanted to no longer have that morning coffee, but I was to continue to leave the coffee machine in the kitchen, every day I walk down through the door, I walk into the kitchen, the first thing I look upon is the coffee machine. I'm going to make it incredibly difficult for myself to keep to my new habit of not having a coffee in the morning. And this is really, really important because at this stage, if the trigger is still there and the cue is still in place, I'm using my willpower to overcome my bad habit. And the issue is that the willpower actually over a period of time will actually overcome the situation. Namely, I can't hold on with my willpower long enough to actually maintain my habit. And all my good intention over time, as James Clear talks about, is the curve of latent potential. What's happening at the curve of latent potential is over time, I get worn down, my willpower gets worn down, and as a result, I slip back into my bad habit. The next one is the cue. And this is really important because this is all about the environment. So for example, if my room has a PlayStation or an Xbox or another computer, or it has some sort of other distraction, if I'm doing work in a space that's full of distraction or full of the tools that I often use in terms of distracting behavior, I need to actually change my environment. I need to actually change the cue. So that means I need to go and find a new place, whether it's the kitchen table or a place that's quiet. The key thing is noise is actually going to work against creating a new habit because it distracts the student. This notion of listening to music is actually not helpful because if I sit here and I'm listening to music while I'm doing my study, what we need to understand is at the end of the day, that's counteractive to me. And what we need to understand there is that the cue, we need to disrupt the cue if we want to disrupt the habit. The third one is changing friction or increasing friction. What this is making it harder and harder and harder for me to engage with that previous habit. And what we see here is friction is where we start taking things away. So as parents at various stages, you might have to remove something from your child's environment. For example, I might need to remove one of if my daughter has an iPad and we notice that that homework is taking a lot longer, she's distracted, the iPad is actually working against her focus and attention. What we need to do is we need to change the friction, we need to increase the friction, and therefore we remove the device. Or in terms of using the device, we remove those elements such as software, apps, and so forth that actually enable them to be distracted and fall back into that bad habit. So whether it's removing the PlayStation or Xbox during school term, what you're doing there is you're increasing the friction. Yes, the student may still go and get access to the PlayStation and the Xbox, but they may be only able to do that on the weekend. What you're doing there is from Monday to Friday, you've increased the friction because you've disrupted the cue and you've removed the trigger of the PlayStation or Xbox. The last one is substitution. Substitution is where we basically replace one thing for another. And we often see this in dieting. What happens is when we want to get fit, okay, and we want to go on a diet, often we will substitute one thing, the bad thing, or the thing that we're trying to kick for something else. We also see this, for example, when people are smoking and they're trying to give up cigarettes. What they'll do is they'll basically remove the cigarette and replace it with, say, nicotine. What this is doing is this is allowing us to still partake in the nicotine hit, but we've actually substituted out. What we've done there is we've substituted the cigarettes for the nicotine gum or the nicotine patch. What that's trying to do is give us a way that we can break that bad habit over time. So, in the other element that we're going to look at today as well is how does media, in particular mobile phones and other devices, impact a student's attention? What we need to understand is that there is actually a challenge out there at the moment. There's a contested field for students' attention. What we also need to understand is that a distracted student isn't a student that's actually learning. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is in particular around mobile phones and social media. One of the things that we often talk about with parents who seek advice in relation to helping their sons maintain their focus and attention at home is that we need to remove the mobile phone from the environment altogether. Even what we need to understand here is that by removing the mobile phone, we're taking away both the trigger and we're substituting it out. By removing the object, we're actually allowing the student or ourselves to focus our attention on the job at hand. But what's really interesting is that there are a series of reports from the Common Sense Census, which is an American outfit, which has been tracking social media use by students and the impact of the pandemic over a period of time. And what we see here is that over time, as time's going on, the students' time is being contested, where they're spending more and more time with their mobile phones, whether it be playing games on Spotify or on social media such as Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and so forth. What's happening there is we're contesting our students' attention is becoming a contested battlefield where we want them to focus. But what's happening is that their attention is being diverted, being split to the mobile phone. Yes, their work may be in front of them, but the issue is that once that split attention takes place, we're actually detracting and we're diminishing the amount of learning that's actually taking place. What we need to look at here is in the last year, in particular with the COVID pandemic, is the increase of student media use by tweens and teens in relation to using their screens for entertainment. So the challenge here is that if I'm in a room and I have my mobile phone and it's pinging all the time, even though it might be silent, even though the screen's off, it's sitting next to my computer or it's in my proximity, every time I hear a ding, automatically the student's attention is leaving the actual the space that we actually want to engage them in. And what we're actually seeing is their attention is being diverted. Whenever their attention is diverted, what's happening here is that at the end of the day, we're learning less. Okay, and what's really important is as they're learning less, what's challenging here is that we have a contested game plan. So my suggestion is that we need to remove the mobile phone, aka the cue, from the environment. When we remove the cue, we need to see it as a positive reward. What we need to look at is how we can remove the distraction, thereby increasing the efficacy of our student attention on the task. Thereby they're learning much more efficiently and effectively. And then the mobile phone or the social media or the game or so forth is the reward, but not in the environment that our students need to work in at the same point in time. Now, the other popular mechanism here is that students often believe that they can multitask. And the issue is that multitasking is actually an incredible enemy to attention. What's interesting here is that the students believe that because they can multitask and they can switch between tasks every few seconds, that they're actually multitasking, but they're not. They're splitting their attention every time. And what's happening here is that the theory or the science at the moment is the students are becoming accustomed to states of half attention, where my attention is in front of me at the moment, what I'm working on, but the other half of my attention is sitting there looking, not directly looking at my phone, but I know the phone is there. And every time, and there's this feeling like I have to be connected to my phone because I've basically trained myself to believe that I can operate in two spaces at the same time. The issue here is that what we're doing is we're training our students to split their attention. So they only give half of here and half of there. The issue is when it's half here and half there, they never give 100%. And what we know about the mind, in particular how the brain works, there are three types of memory: the sensory memory, the working memory, and the long-term memory. The issue is that when our attention is split, our sensory memory, in which all information comes in to our brain, if that's only working at half capacity, therefore only half the learning is taking place, even though I'm spending an hour or 2 hours working. What we need to understand is while that mobile phone is sitting there, your students, your son, your daughter is actually giving half of their effort, even though they feel like they're contributing. And what's really interesting is John Hutton, who's a pediatrician in America, said that what's happening is our students are being trained through the use of mobile phones and media outside of the classroom. And what's happening is that what we're doing is we're encountering this idea that students are giving half attention or third attention or a quarter of attention in multiple different spheres. Even when they are in the classroom, because they're being trained by the split attention, that they're already thinking about glancing to the next sentence or glancing to the next task or glancing over here. And what we see students is they alt, for example, with their devices, there's this thing called alt tab. And alt tab is a way that they can switch between their screens really, really quickly. And you watch how quickly an adolescent can actually switch their screens. What's happening is that that screen switching is actually manifesting in relation to their attention in the classroom. But what this means is at home, we actually need to remove those cues and those distractors, because while they're there, your son or your daughter is actually only giving half of their attention and focus. So the homework for this week is in the Parent ALT study program page in MyChurchy, we've set up a discussion board. In that discussion board, the question that we're looking at today is, what are the factors and practices that impact your son's homework and study routine at home? What we're interested in doing is learning from you about what are those practices and factors that both positively and negatively impact your son's homework and study habits. What are the barriers and the enablers that you are seeing from a parent's perspective? Okay, so that's where we're at. So what I've done is I've allowed for some time, and hopefully this works. This is the first time we've done it, in which in the YouTube, we have the ability for you to write a question. So for the next 4 or 5 minutes, we're opening up and allowing you to type a question into the chat of a question that you would like answered. So what I'll do is I will remove the presentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at and engage with the chat. And if you've got any questions, we'll spend the next 4 to 5 minutes by going through and answering those questions. So if you have a question based on today's presentation, please write it in the chat now, and I'll do my best to answer it. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the session. There haven't been any questions raised in the chat. Hopefully you've found, and it would be great to receive any feedback from you from today's session in relation to changing up the interactivity, being able to put and post questions in the chat. Hopefully you are able to engage with the chat. And at the end of the day, what we're looking at is creating this mechanism, this forum, on a regular basis that we can engage with you and that you can seek the best advice and guidance in relation to your son. So as there aren't any questions in the chat today, this video will obviously go up on YouTube. Interestingly, last week, we've had over 180 hits on the video since our first broadcast a fortnight ago, which is great engagement. Please, at any time, you can still write questions in the chat, and I'm able to actually answer questions at a later date. Please fill out the discussion board. Our next session will be focused on looking at how do we prepare for our students right before exam time, namely how we can actually look at utilizing the practice test as a way of actually engaging in formative feedback. And what we're looking at is a simple system rather than a simple system for helping you and your son use the practice test. So I just got a question from Jedi Knight, so it's just come through. So everything for school is on the school computer, so constantly has screen time, and 100% certain he is on YouTube rather than schoolwork. How to monitor this? So one of the things is when we look at looking at YouTube in particular, how can you as a parent monitor it? So obviously at times we go through and look at various problems that students often experience. If you're wanting to look at how a student is engaging with their device, the easiest way, and this is what I do with my daughter who goes to a school which is BYOD. So in a BYOD school, nothing is filtered. It's a completely open device. There's no protection. Myself as a parent has to engage with all the safety and monitoring software. The best way to actually check what your son is doing, whether it be at home or not, is simply get their device and simply go through their internet history. What's really interesting is the internet history logs everything. And I would basically, that's what I do with my daughter, is I literally go through and once a week just have a quick scan. What happens is over a period of time, by actually me knowing how the computer works and actually engaging with and monitoring it physically, like I physically pick up the device and physically engage with the device. In terms of the school has obviously the firewall, and that firewall stops students from going to particular sites, and those particular firewall settings are adapted on a daily basis. At school though, often most of what we're seeing is YouTube for education. And so when things are tagged with YouTube for education, that's what they are often seeing. But outside of school time, the YouTube for education filtering ceases because of the parameters of actually the provision of the firewall on the device. That said though, if you do have particular concerns, please get in contact with your housemaster or IT services and they can go through that. So thank you for the people who've engaged with the chat. What we're going to do is we'll end the session now. A reminder to engage with the discussion board about the factors looking at the factors to actually help your son in the latter part of the term prepare for their exams. And we're going to look at how a student and teachers use a practice test for the greatest efficiency and effectiveness. Also, please engage with the blog and look at what are the barriers and enablers that you are finding as a parent, which is fighting for your students' attention at home. Thank you once again, and thank you for your feedback and the questions. We're going to keep evolving the nature of this parental engagement, and hopefully this can become a valuable tool for both the school and the parental community here at Churchie. Thank you very much and have a great day.